Affairs think tank. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. My name is Michael Horowitz. I am the interim director of Perry Worldhouse and a professor of political science. Today's guest is Professor David Barnes. Professor Barnes is Associate Professor of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of The Making of a Social Disease, Tuberculosis in 19th Century France, and The Great Stink of Paris. Awesome book title. His research interests include the politics of international disease control programs in the 20th century and the history of the Lazaretto quarantine station on the Delaware River right outside of Philadelphia. He received his BA from Yale and his PhD from UC Berkeley. Professor Barnes, thank you for joining us today at Perry Worldhouse, and the floor is yours to give us some introductory thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I sincerely wish that my work were not as relevant as it is today, but here we are, and if nothing else, we might as well take advantage of this opportunity to think systematically and carefully about the crisis we're in the midst of, and if I can offer some historical perspective that's useful, or gives people a different vantage point from which to approach this situation, then great. I just want to start off by mentioning a couple of things, a couple of lessons or kind of weapons from the toolkit of a historian that that come from my research on the history of public health, and especially the history of infectious disease. First of all, epidemics have always been like social X-rays. They reveal otherwise hidden fractures and weaknesses in society, but they don't just reveal fractures and weaknesses. Epidemics also function as what I would call inequality accelerators. And so they don't just show us where inequalities have always existed or currently exist, they intensify and worsen existing inequalities. And we're seeing that happen, unfortunately, today, all around the world. And I think that's one thing we as scholars can offer, is to look at this not as a phenomenon that is, that has come from out of nowhere and has affected us all equally. It hasn't affected us all equally. Okay, and then there are some common myths and misconceptions about epidemics and infectious disease that that frustrate me, and that I think stand in our way when we're trying to get to some kind of pragmatic, effective way of improving public health. The first is that health policy consists essentially in providing access to medical care and pharmaceutical products. I think the history of public health shows us that the kinds of public policy that affect population health most significantly are not related to providing access to medical care and access to drugs or medicines, but rather policies that improve standards of living, that empower populations to take control over their lives. And we've seen numerous examples throughout history of population health improving dramatically in the absence of any obvious change in medicine. Second major myth and misconception is that effective public health responses to particular diseases or health threats are and must be disease-specific responses. This is an understandable assumption given the history of medical knowledge and given the way public health has developed historically as a discipline, but it's frankly wrong. it's not true that the only effective responses to health threats are disease-specific responses, such as vaccines or drugs that target specific germs. We can talk more about that if folks are interested. The next major misconception has to do with immunity. And immunity is the critical dimension of inequality in the COVID-19 pandemic, and really has been in most epidemics throughout history. Our common way of understanding immunity seems to be that immunity is a binary state. You're either immune to something or you're not. And secondarily, that immunity is an exogenous variable. It's something that is either conferred by genetics or comes from a vaccine. In fact, immunity is not a binary state. It's relative, and it's profoundly amenable to policy interventions. In other words, public policy can, and I would say must, focus on improving the ability of people to, improving people's ability to withstand infections like COVID-19. Again, lots more to talk about there if people are interested. One of the most damaging misconceptions about infectious disease is the commonly used refrain, germs don't discriminate. And technically, of course, that's true. Microorganisms can't see or hear or perceive race or class or gender. However, it's abundantly clear throughout history that germs do discriminate, have always discriminated, and germs are discriminating right now. They affect populations unequally, and it's that unequal impact that it's our responsibility to investigate and to fix. Finally, on a similar note, I hear all the time that public health isn't political and should not be politicized. And again, it's just wrong, and it's a problem to think that way. Now, I think what people mean when they say public health shouldn't be politicized is that public health problems and public health policies shouldn't be turned into opportunities for short-term partisan advantage. And that, of course, is absolutely the case. However, public health is and always has been inherently political because it's about the distribution of resources in societies. And that's the essence of politics. COVID-19 is a political problem, and it ought to be addressed with political solutions. That doesn't mean conservative solutions or progressive solutions. It doesn't mean, partisan solutions. It means solutions that address the distribution of resources and access to resources within society. That's the only way that we can solve the underlying problems that are making certain people, particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. The same has been the case throughout history. I suppose I'll leave it at that for now. If folks are looking at the background behind me and wondering what it is, I'll just say that.
That was going to be my first question.
Okay, all right. I'm a step ahead of you.
Tell us.
Yes, the image behind me is the newly restored main building at the Lazaretto Quarantine Station historic site outside Philadelphia on the Delaware River in Essington, Tinicum Township. And if folks are interested, I'd be happy to share some thoughts about my research on the history of the Lazaretto, which operated as a quarantine station for the Port of Philadelphia throughout the 19th century. It was built beginning in 1799. It ceased functioning as a quarantine station in 1895. It was built in response to a series of devastating yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s. And quarantine was, and the lazaretto was a political institution fundamentally, and it was always controversial. And yeah, there's some interesting stories and lessons perhaps from the lazaretto's history. I think, the people are understandably hungry for lessons from history. And I think we all should be, when we hear any putative expert telling us what the lessons of history are, we should always be skeptical. The lessons of history, in my view, don't come in neatly packaged directives, but rather they take the form of patterns and resonances that we could see between different episodes. And we have to, historians are generally obsessed with focusing on the particularities of each time and place, and how the contingencies and unique circumstances of any place and time or particular society influenced events and behaviors. So particularities are important, but there are some patterns that can be useful to us, and that can at least prompt us to ask certain questions that aren't generally being asked about problems we face today.
So I actually want to follow up with something on historical lessons. Understanding the limitations. Are there any past pandemics that you think could offer us some guidance? I'll bet limited for today. I mean, people, one of the questions in the Q&A asks about the Spanish flu in particular. And is there something we could be learning from that could help us, either us as citizens, or citizens of the world or of the United States, or wherever people are, or from a policy perspective that could help us get through this?
Yeah, well, okay, I'm glad you asked about the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. I've started calling it the Kansas flu, because Spanish flu is deeply misleading. Right. Most people know that it really didn't originate in Spain at all. Spain was a neutral country during World War I, and therefore didn't have military censorship of the press or informal agreements with the press to not report bad news. So the first reports of flu epidemics did come out of Spain. There are a number of theories about the actual origin of the 1918 flu pandemic, but the earliest reported cases of an unusual strain of flu that was particularly deadly came from southwestern Kansas. So I think, as a corrective to this tendency to associate epidemics with faraway exotic places, or with foreignness, or with strange people and strange practices, this is a very common theme in the history of epidemics, and it's a big problem. It makes really harmful and even violent responses more likely, and it's an impediment to actually effective responses. So just as a corrective, I started calling the 1918 flu the Kansas flu. Excuse me. What are the lessons of 1918? I hate to say it, but not all that much changed during and after the 1918 flu.
I was going to ask you about that, about whether after pandemics we normally see more of a return to normalcy, or whether we see sort of more revolutionary change.
Yeah, well, it depends on the circumstances. So when yellow fever hit Philadelphia in 1793, devastating epidemic, 10% of the population was killed in the span of a couple of months. And then yellow fever actually returned again, and 3 more times in the late 1790s, really exacting a horrific toll on the city, which was the nation's capital at the time. It was the nation's largest city and the nation's busiest seaport. That epidemic did have an effect, or those epidemics, I should say, the city established a Board of Health in 1794 in the aftermath of the 1793 epidemic. And the Board of Health, while it was unsuccessful in preventing the return of yellow fever in the late 1790s, did eventually come to assume considerable authority in intervening to help improve the health of the city. Their primary responsibilities were to enforce a quarantine, and the Board of Health, after in 1799, started building this new quarantine station, which you see behind me. But it also was responsible for cleaning up the city. And the most common theories about yellow fever at the time were, on the one hand, that it was contagious and was imported from overseas, especially from the West Indies, aboard ships. And the other theory was that yellow fever originated locally in accumulations of filth under certain weather conditions. So the Board of Health essentially decided to act as if both of these theories were true and enforced a quarantine and worked to clean up the city. That's an example, establishing a Board of Health that doesn't just meet and issue proclamations, but that actually does something, is an example of something productive and, at least over the long term, relatively effective, coming out of the aftermath of a traumatic epidemic. Let's see, in the 19th century, cholera swept through Europe and North America 3 or 4 times. And in 1849, especially, it was the second major cholera pandemic. It happened in the midst of, or in the immediate aftermath of, revolutionary upheaval throughout Europe. And in fact, cholera epidemics were associated with political uprisings in a number of countries. Now, I don't want to say the epidemics caused the uprisings, because the revolutionary upheaval began before cholera. However, the previous cholera pandemic of 1831, 1832 had exposed inequalities. It had galvanized agitation for democracy or for redistribution of wealth. Socialist movement was taking shape throughout Europe. And so while I can't say that cholera sparked revolution, I can't say that cholera intensified the social cleavages that were manifesting themselves through these revolutionary upheavals. And in fact, the series of cholera epidemics in Europe and North America did result in public health reforms, at least indirectly. And we see in the larger cities of Europe and North America, you see a movement to build parks, for example, to provide green space in these increasingly overcrowded and unsanitary cities. You see the building of sewer systems, the building of clean water supply systems, and you see increasing efforts to clean up the unsanitary urban environment. That's at least an indirect result of these traumatic cholera epidemics. And then to take the example of the 1918 flu, there really weren't, the public health infrastructures were in place in most countries. Obviously, the geopolitical order was radically transformed in the aftermath of World War I, but not because of the pandemic. And there's not all that much change in public health policy or public health institutions in the aftermath of what, demographically speaking, was the greatest public health disaster in history.
So let me follow up with some questions that have come in through the Q&A that get to the question of immunity. You mentioned the notion of immunity is not a binary, yet in a lot of the discussions that we're seeing about what longer term public health responses to coronavirus look like, there's this discussion of herd immunity. So can you tell us, can you maybe expand a little bit in a historical context about what it means for immunity to not be a binary and what that might mean for us for when it's safe to reopen?
Yeah, sure. I guess it's helpful to, I'm not an immunologist, I'm not a medical doctor. I do, you know, that not having formal medical training obviously is a disadvantage in all sorts of ways, but it also actually causes people like me to ask the kind of emperor's new clothes types of questions, which can be helpful. I would argue, at least, as long as we're not the only voices in the room. So it's I think it might be helpful, to oversimplifying greatly, to think of immunity, to think of two different kinds of immunity. There's disease-specific immunity, which causes one to be resistant to infection or to illness from one particular germ or pathogen. So, for example, diseases like smallpox, or there are a number of different viral diseases in which surviving a case of smallpox provides lifetime immunity, and that's the origin of the practice of variolation, which was, prior to vaccination, the practice of deliberately inoculating someone with smallpox in order to cause a mild case and provide lifelong immunity. And then Edward Jenner came along in the 1790s and came up with vaccination, which was deliberately inoculating people with cowpox, a different but related disease that was always mild, in order to provide immunity to smallpox. So that's disease-specific immunity. When I say that immunity isn't a binary state, I'm talking about more generalized property of bodily resistance to infection that causes certain people to be more resistant to infection with any kind of germ, not just one particular germ. So people who are well nourished, people who are well rested, people who are well housed and well clothed, all of these things that we generally take for granted as fundamental features of modern life, modern civilized life, are immune boosters. They're it's not just nutritional status, but it's a state of general bodily well-being and strength that accounts for the fact that, in general, wealthier countries and wealthier populations within countries tend to suffer less from infectious diseases. And you see that effect over time, as well as societies become more prosperous, as standards of living improve, mortality from infectious diseases declines. And I just want to add here a very important, I would say, if I had to choose one fact from the history of public health that I would want everyone in the world to know, that is generally unknown, it's that the decline of infectious diseases in the industrializing world, which took place, generally speaking, from the mid 19th century through the middle of the 20th century. This is the greatest achievement in the history of public health. Most public health folks will tell you that the eradication of smallpox is the greatest achievement in the history of public health. In terms of lives saved, the decline in mortality from infectious disease in the industrializing world is the greatest achievement in the history of public health, in my view. And it happened in the absence of significant advances in medicine. Medical science, pharmaceutical treatments had nothing to do, or almost nothing to do, with the huge decline in mortality from infectious diseases in the industrializing world. And this fact is associated with the work of Thomas McCune, a British physician and professor of social medicine. And McCune hypothesized that the reason for the huge improvement in population health in the industrializing West was the gradual improvement of standards of living. He particularly credited advances in nutrition from essentially better wealth and better food production. However, many demographers and historians have taken issue with that aspect of McCune's argument because he doesn't have a lot of detailed evidence. But I'm emphasizing this because this is a profound fact of history. And when we now, this doesn't mean that medicine doesn't have an important role to play in public health today. Of course it does. And vaccines are an important element of the public health arsenal, as well as treatments. But improving standards of living, nutrition, the length of the work week, okay, so improving the people's ability to sleep and rest, improving housing, improving access to, adequate clothing and shelter. These are vital factors, not just in faraway developing countries, but right here in the United States. And these are the factors, I think, when the dust settles from this pandemic, we're going to see, we're already seeing clearly that certain populations are disproportionately affected. And we're going to see essentially a hidden epidemic of weakened immunity. And it's not just old age, but that is, older people, immune systems gradually weaken with advanced age. And that's why older people are at greater risk from this and many other infectious diseases. All right, I'll stop it. I'll stop there. I've got more to say on that front, but I really think that's a critical truth and one that I'm not seeing discussed in the media or even in the scholarship these days.
I think it's fascinating, the idea that medicine alone won't save us. It's really it's broader health and well-being that's actually critical. And I want to follow up on something that connects actually your answer to my last question with something you said at the beginning when you were talking about inequality. So if a degree of inequality is why don't we say there's inequality baked into society for lots of different reasons, ex ante, and we're in the world that we're in now. So are there any historical lessons, or how should we be thinking about what can we do to help reduce that inequality, both in our response to the pandemic today? And how do we think about that? And perhaps this gets to the distinction between intervention today versus prevention for the future.
Yeah, great question. Eventually we get into the territory of kind of how do we solve poverty and these fundamental questions that that folks have been wrestling with for centuries. And I certainly don't have the answer to that. However, I can say, I'll go back to my very first point that epidemics are social x-rays. I think we have to take this crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, as an opportunity to look at where the worst damage is being done and look at the populations that are most severely affected. Now, some inequalities are obvious. Lack of access to hospitals, or underfunded or understaffed hospitals without sufficient protective equipment or ventilators. And those things, we knew about those things already. Those inequalities are especially acute right now, and they're costing lives right now. But I think we can look deeper than that, beyond just hospitals and medical equipment, and see vulnerabilities. One example of a scholarly work that actually achieved some um, public visibility um, is a book called Heat Wave by Eric Kleinenberg, sociologist at NYU. Um, uh, I highly recommend this book. It's the story of a heat wave in Chicago in 1995. And Kleinenberg called his method a social autopsy. And he took the heat wave and the unequal impact of the heat wave as an opportunity um, to do a social autopsy of the city of Chicago. Where was the damage worse? What were the particular characteristics the people who died in the heat wave shared? And how did, for example, he looked closely at low-income minority communities that suffered high mortality from the heat wave and compared them to low-income minority communities that suffered low mortality during the heat wave. And he examined the degree of street life, the degree to which different neighborhoods were served by public transit, which offers opportunities for people to get out of the house, to get to jobs, to do their shopping. He looked at all kinds of factors. Anyway, what I'm suggesting is that we have an opportunity now, even in the midst of the epidemic, to look at where the crisis is worst, where the worst damage is being done, and look at those communities and ask what makes them different. So Native American communities, I read an article the other day about the tremendous damage that's being done by COVID-19 in Indian country, and it's devastating. That's a hidden epidemic of inequality that's been going on for years that we don't pay attention to. This offers us an opportunity and really demands that we pay attention to those places. And then after, let's hope in a number of months, when the epidemic is at least receding, we'll have better data, we'll have better information on what happened and where, which geographic areas were disproportionately affected, which socioeconomic, which ethnic groups were most affected, and we'll have a chance to redirect resources to the areas that we might have known all along were most vulnerable, but now we actually have a better sense of who really was most vulnerable. Hurricane Katrina and other natural disasters those are also opportunities for social X-rays of this sort.
So you've done a lot of work on shifting gears a tiny bit, but sort of moving maybe more from prevention and intervention to the question of control. You've done a lot of work on international disease controls, and in some ways, one could imagine, I guess, quarantine stations as part of some of those efforts. What are there comparisons or lessons you think we can draw from that? In some ways, from your background, and about the effectiveness of those kinds of efforts as we all maybe get a little tired of staying at home all the time, or maybe I don't know whether the right comparisons might be to COVID-19 or to maybe other recent outbreaks. How should we think about this based on your historical research?
Sure. Well, let's look back at the cholera epidemics of the 19th century. One thing that emerged very directly from the cholera epidemics so the first one to hit Europe was 1831, 1832. The next one was 1849, and after the 1849 epidemic, those two epidemics also hit in North America as well. After 1849, the great powers convened a series of international sanitary conferences, starting in the early 1850s and running all the way through roughly to 1900 or so. A series of international sanitary conferences that were originally designed to develop a uniform quarantine policy throughout at least throughout Europe, throughout the Mediterranean basin, but ideally, eventually, worldwide, a uniform international quarantine policy. They failed. They were an utter failure in the sense of their originally stated mission. Quarantine was deeply political, was deeply unpopular in many places, and it was bad for business, bad for trade, for obvious reasons.
I mean, we're familiar with that today and talking. I mean, think about the conversations we're having now.
Absolutely, absolutely, and so they couldn't come to agreement on a uniform quarantine policy. However, the longer-lasting legacy of the failed international sanitary conferences was an informal infrastructure and a set of relationships among health authorities in different countries to communicate with one another and to share information. And this was, at least taking the long view, this was more successful because that sort of international surveillance networks, public health folks use the term surveillance to indicate, very careful tracking of diseases from place to place, and sharing. Critical part of surveillance is sharing information widely and openly. And surveillance, effective international surveillance, implies being transparent, not hiding cases of illness or disease outbreaks in your country, and sharing information immediately and widely. So that's the long-term legacy of the failed international sanitary conferences that came out of the cholera epidemics of the 19th century. And then eventually there's a fascinating history that's only partially written so far of international health institutions in the 20th century, beginning with the League of Nations Health Office. The League of Nations is, historically speaking, something of a backwater because it sort of symbolizes everything that failed in the aftermath of World War I.
Right, like for political science scholars, it's not like it's got the best reputation as an effective international institution.
Yeah, it's everything you want to avoid, right? But if you actually look at what the League of Nations did, one of the things they did was establish a health office, which is the predecessor of the WHO. Many people haven't heard of it, and I can't say the League of Nations Health Office, developed any particularly effective interventions. They did study. They did study health problems in many parts of the world, urban health and particularly rural health problems. Their studies of rural health problems that came from the League of Nations Health Office that really read today like state-of-the-art studies of health inequalities. And it's fascinating that the League of Nations Health Office joined with foundations and what today we would call NGOs to study the effect of local innovative local public health programs in places like China. And those programs, this was the 1920s and 30s, and capitalism seemed to be in crisis. And there were some fascinating public health programs that aimed not at eradicating individual diseases, which was something that people were already discussing in the 1920s and 30s, but rather at empowering poor and uneducated peasants and workers to give them skills, to give them education, practical education and literacy to improve their lives. And the tragedy is that these local programs in China and elsewhere never got a chance to really fully develop because, well, in China the Japanese invaded, and eventually another world war came and wiped out everything the League of Nations Health Office was working
Right.
on, and wiped out the League of Nations itself.
So I want to shift back to some of the really interesting points you've made about societal health and societal health measures as important both for addressing this pandemic and for the future. We have a question here wondering, can history teach us anything about society-wide changes we might see? So let's move beyond what we would like to see to what you think we might see. What wide changes might we see in terms of social good provision? Is this the moment to be pushing universal health care, universal basic income, those sorts of things?
Yeah.
Have these kinds of events historically created opportunities for that type of social change?
Yes and no. I think there are reasons. There are plenty of reasons in history for pessimism. There are also some causes for optimism, I think. On the question of whether this is the time to be reconsidering universal health care or universal basic income, I have to say, if COVID-19 doesn't cause people to think about why some of our fellow citizens don't have access to healthcare, I have no idea what possibly could. And I don't know what will happen. And thank you, Mike, for not asking me to predict the future. Historians are generally better at predicting the past than the future. But universal basic income is something that was very recently a fringe idea. Some people still consider it a fringe idea, but I think it's possible that this pandemic will reignite discussions that will cause people to take seriously what very recently was something that was kind of a punchline. Now, looking back to the past, I talked about the extent to which epidemics have long-term positive results in public health reforms and the development of institutions and communications in public health, especially internationally. But we can also look at AIDS. AIDS is a pandemic that I haven't seen discussed very often in connection with COVID-19. The diseases are very different, of course, and they affect, to some extent, different communities and different populations, but there is overlap. AIDS was also a social X-ray of a slightly different sort. And what did we see come out of AIDS? So one of the things, I'll even go back to yellow fever in Philadelphia in the 1790s. And one of the consequences, one of the things that you saw emerge in Philadelphia was informal networks of volunteers to provide emergency assistance. So there was a widespread belief in the 1790s that
Interesting.
that people of African descent were immune to yellow fever, and it's not true. I think that belief probably came from observing the fact that some Africans in the U.S. had been exposed to yellow fever as children. Yellow fever is generally milder in kids and confers immunity. So there were some free blacks in Philadelphia who probably were immune to yellow fever. Anyway, there was belief in this general immunity, and Benjamin Rush, famous Philadelphia physician, and others actively recruited free Africans in Philadelphia to help provide nursing care, to help transport the sick, and to help bury the dead. And indeed, particularly under the leadership of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, to free Black preachers in Philadelphia. A community of volunteers was organized and provided invaluable service during that epidemic. And I think, so I think it's those informal networks of volunteers providing emergency assistance that can continue after the crisis is over, that actually change people's perceptions, even if only slightly, about their fellow citizens and create relationships that didn't exist before that can be productive in the future. Now, fast forward to AIDS in the 1980s and 90s,
Right.
you see the emergence of activist groups like ACT UP, very in your face, not interested in playing nice, not interested in being polite, and demanding visibility, demanding attention. Eventually, ACT UP, while they never abandoned their confrontational tactics, developed a strategy alongside the very public in-your-face demonstrations of learning the language of medical science, of attending scientific meetings, of talking to medical researchers and government health bureaucrats about research and treatment, and achieved remarkable success through this combination of in-your-face confrontation and more diplomatic sort of playing behind the scenes in bureaucracy and in medical science. We also saw in the medium term a much greater visibility for the gay community, a much despised and largely invisible subpopulation within the United States. And eventually, I'm not the only person to have said this, but the AIDS epidemic led eventually to the legalization of gay marriage, which was unthinkable to many of us who lived through AIDS and who saw the discrimination and stigma and violence directed at the gay community in this country. And this is not to say that gay marriage wouldn't eventually have been legalized without AIDS, and it's impossible to play that counterfactual game anyway. But it's indisputable that AIDS made the gay community in this country visible, and eventually led to people realizing that gay people are us. They're everywhere. We all gay people are part of everybody's lives, every family, every workplace, and that realization, I think, led to the legalization of gay marriage. So I think there are reasons for hope.
So here's another area where maybe there's a reason for hope here, maybe not, and you can educate us. Previous speakers in our virtual event series have brought up the importance of engaging the private sector in addressing pandemics. And are there good historical examples that you can think about from your research of companies or other private sector actors? You just mentioned volunteers in Philadelphia, for example. But what role has the private sector traditionally played in this response? We see this play out in some ways almost every day in say President Trump's briefings, where you have the question of private sector responsibilities versus states, versus the federal government.
Sure. Well, the private sector is great at doing things that promise profit at the end. So when it comes to pharmaceutical research, most people don't understand the degree to which the private sector capitalizes on publicly funded research in developing its products. But be that as it may, the profit-making companies have been responsible for tremendous breakthroughs in the pharmaceutical industry. So the private sector in times of crisis will sometimes, for either through civic-minded goodwill or through some more sort of calculated sense of self-interest, will collaborate with governments, with nonprofits, and even companies collaborating with their competitors. We're seeing some of that today in COVID-19 to facilitate progress. So I think I guess the only generalization I could draw with respect to the role of the private sector is that times of crisis will tend to break down or facilitate the breakdown of certain barriers that inhibit collaboration, and that's clearly a good thing. I think it's understandable, but it's a mistake to look to the private sector, and especially the pharmaceutical industry, for salvation, while an effective and safe vaccine against COVID-19 will absolutely be a game changer. It's I think history tells us that vaccines vaccines don't have beneficial impacts beyond one particular disease, and the next epidemic is likely to be a different disease for which the COVID-19 vaccine won't provide protection. Yeah, again, that's outside of my my area of expertise, but I think historically speaking, vaccines have been important, and certainly the smallpox vaccine most of all, but they were not the primary drivers, have not been the primary drivers of population health improvements anywhere in the world at any time.
So here's a slightly different question from the Q&A, and it says, we are all having trouble acclimating to isolation, but at least many of us have the internet and TV. What evidence do we have for how people coped with the isolation of epidemics of the past?
Yeah, what a great question, and I'm looking at my own background here to try to put myself in the shoes of folks who were cooped up at the lazaretto, or or in quarters aboard ships that were that were anchored in the river immediately opposite. And quarantine at the lazaretto outside Philadelphia, at least in the 19th century, would last anywhere from 36 hours to a couple of weeks. On rare occasions, a ship or its cargo could be detained for a month or more, but usually it was 2 weeks or less. But even that seemed like an eternity to a lot of people, and we don't have first-person accounts from very many people who underwent quarantine at the lazaretto, but we do have some. Everybody hated quarantine. It was universally disliked.
So it's not just us.
Even by its advocates. And of course, merchants hated quarantine because quarantine cut into profits, and quarantine meant delay and spoilage, etc. And for sailors and sea captains, it was an impediment to getting on to the next job, or at least being able to take one's earnings and enjoy them. And for passengers, of course, it was tremendously inconvenient, and it was boring. So people complained about quarantine. They wrote a lot of letters. The mail went back and forth from the lazaretto twice a day. And there were times when mail had to be disinfected either through
Sure.
steam treatment or through the application of chemical disinfectants. And people were mostly resigned. There was one occasion at the Lazaretto in 1804. There was a riot. There was an unusual number of people undergoing quarantine at that time. There was a large migration of people from German-speaking parts of Europe. During the Napoleonic Wars, there was an exodus from especially German-speaking countries to the New World. And these people were poor, desperate, and starving. And those immigrant ships crossing the Atlantic were essentially factories for producing typhus. Typhus was also known as ship fever or famine fever at the time, and it thrived in crowded, filthy conditions with people who were hungry or starving. And so there were several different ships being quarantined, each of which had 100 or more passengers, and it became very crowded, and the quarantines lasted for weeks and weeks in that year in 1804. And passengers on one ship got fed up and rioted and caused a couple of $100 worth of damage, which was quite a bit at the time.
At the time, presumably.
Yeah. But to me, it's surprising that it didn't happen more often. There were occasionally folks who escaped from quarantine. One immigrant, one German immigrant, who did arrive in that same summer of 1804, was stuck at the Lazaretto. He said he got excellent care there and the food was excellent, but he was desperate to get away. He just couldn't stand being confined there any longer. So he found a weak link in the fence surrounding the Lazaretto and he escaped. So I think of him often. He said he was very well cared for and he was grateful. Right. He was a young man. He was, maybe I think he was 18 or 20 or 22 years old. And he was impatient, and we're all impatient. And our quarantine is very different from, it's not just the internet, it's not just our entertainment options, but, these were, it only lasted for, as I said, a couple of weeks or less, and occasionally longer, but it was very confining, and people were in close quarters and just desperate to move on with their lives. And yeah, that's it's definitely resonating today. We're all impatient.
Sure.
And we all, I think there's so much entrenched political polarization in our country, especially. But I think this is a time to realize that, there are all kinds of trite cliches about how we're all in this together, but the people we disagree most vehemently with also care about human life, also want people to thrive, want people to be healthy, and I think maybe this crisis, this disruption of everybody's life, will give us an opportunity to recognize that there are some things, maybe not everything, but there are some things that we all want, and we can work towards that.
It's a great message, and for those of you that are tuned in, we've had about 250, 275 people tuned into this event the whole time. If you check out the chat, you'll see we've dropped links into a lot of the books and articles and events that Professor Barnes has been mentioning. And we just have a minute left, and I want to take you out on and ask for some hope. And that this has been a horrible human tragedy, both in the United States and around the world. If we look back in a couple of years and say, you know, that was awful, but it could have been much worse.
Yeah.
What do you think will need to happen to be able to tell that that story?
Yeah, this is unprecedented. There's no question about it. This is not 1918. I think I certainly hope and I expect that the the final death toll from COVID-19, which will be nowhere near the scale of 1918, when tens of millions of people worldwide were killed. And I don't think that the basic institutions and values that structure our society are imperiled by this. I do hope that some of the some of the structures that cause many of our fellow citizens to have weakened immunity, to be vulnerable to this virus, but also to all kinds of natural disasters. Precarity, precarity is the word we're seeing discussed more often in public policy circles. And precarity is a good word for the condition in which a lot of people live, in which they're getting by day to day, but barely, and they really don't have any opportunity to plan for the future. They don't have any safety net or margin of error, and a crisis like this can be absolutely devastating and deadly. But so I hope some of the structures that create that precarity will be weakened by the response to this pandemic. And I think on an individual human level, there's tremendous opportunity now to provide help to the communities that are most in need. And if this disaster has the effect of making people who are relatively insulated from the damage more aware of where the damage is being done and the conditions that shape the lives of the people who are suffering most severely from this pandemic, then I think that's a good thing. And I think that, as I said before, epidemics and other crises can sometimes facilitate the establishment of relationships across community lines that are generated by an emergency, by coming together to meet an immediate need, but that can endure after the emergency is over. And that's my hope. I don't, obviously we're in a presidential election year. I already said public health is political, not in this sort of partisan sense, but in the sense of the distribution of resources in society. And but I hope we can see beyond partisan divisions to the fundamental kind of political change that needs to happen.
Well, on that optimistic note, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Professor Barnes for a tremendous conversation today as part of our The World Today series virtually by Perry Worldhouse. Hope everyone will join us next week for our event From Russia with Gloves, Diagnosing Russia's Response to COVID-19, featuring Evgenia Albats, a Russian journalist, Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Sandy Vershbow, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and Deputy Secretary General of NATO, all part of the Perry Worldhouse community. Well, that will be at 3 p.m. Next Tuesday. Everyone, please join me again in thanking Professor Barnes. That was fantastic. I learned so much in that conversation. And I hope you have a great day, and I hope everybody stays safe and healthy.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everybody for the really fascinating questions.
Have a great day, everybody.
All right.